The November wind cut through Sarah Martinez like a blade as she stood at the edge of the highway, her 7-year-old son Miguel clinging to her worn coat. The broken-down sedan behind them had finally given up after 3 days of struggling along back roads, steam rising from its cracked radiator like a white flag of surrender. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and she could see the same hollow look in Miguel's dark eyes that had haunted her for weeks. They had been traveling for 6 days now, fleeing the cramped apartment in Phoenix where the eviction notice had been taped to their door. Sarah's job at the diner had disappeared when the restaurant closed suddenly, and with no family to turn to, she had packed their few belongings and headed toward Colorado, where her sister had promised them a couch to sleep on. But that promise felt as distant as the mountains. She could barely see through the haze. The rural highway stretched endlessly in both directions, with only scattered farmhouses and ranches breaking the monotony of brown grass and barbed wire. No cell phone service reached this forgotten corner of the world, and Sarah had counted only 3 vehicles pass by in the last hour. None had stopped for the woman and child standing beside a dead car with Arizona plates. Miguel tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, I'm really hungry." His voice was barely a whisper, conserving energy that his small body no longer had to spare. They had shared a sleeve of crackers that morning, their last food, and Sarah had given Miguel the larger portion while pretending she wasn't hungry. "I know, baby. We'll find something soon." The words felt like lies on her tongue, but what else could she tell him? That she had exactly $4.37 in her wallet? That the gas tank was empty even if the car had been working? That she had no idea what they would do when darkness fell? As if summoned by her desperation, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing larger as a pickup truck approached from the south. Sarah stepped closer to the road, raising her hand tentatively, hope and desperation warring in her chest. The truck slowed as it drew near, revealing a weathered Ford with a man behind the wheel. She could see him clearly through the windshield, late 50s, with steel-gray hair beneath a worn baseball cap and deep lines carved by years of sun and wind. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw him taking in the scene, the broken car, the woman with dirt-stained clothes, the small boy pressed against her side. Then he accelerated past them without a glance back. Sarah felt her shoulders sag. She had seen that look before, the quick calculation, the decision that they were someone else's problem, the relief of not having to get involved. She couldn't blame him, really. In his place, she might have done the same thing, but 5 minutes later, the same truck reappeared, this time coming from the direction it had been heading. The driver pulled over about 20 feet ahead of them and sat there for a long moment, engine idling. Sarah could see him gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if wrestling with something. Finally, the truck door opened and the man stepped out. He was tall and lean, with the kind of quiet strength that came from a lifetime of physical work. His jeans were clean but faded, his boots practical rather than fancy. When he walked toward them, his pace was measured, deliberate. "Car trouble?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. His voice was deep but soft, with a slight drawl that spoke of roots in this land. Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look, hair unwashed for days, clothes wrinkled from sleeping in the car, the desperate edge that clung to people who had run out of options. The engine overheated. "I think it's finished." The man walked around the sedan, peering under the hood that Sarah had left propped open. Steam no longer rose from the radiator, but the sweet smell of antifreeze hung in the air. After a moment, he straightened and looked at her with pale blue eyes that seemed to take in more than they revealed. "Where you headed?" "Colorado." "My sister?" Sarah started, then stopped. Something about his quiet presence made her want to tell the truth. "We don't have anywhere else to go." He nodded as if he understood more than she had said. His gaze shifted to Miguel, who was trying to hide behind Sarah's legs while peeking out with curious eyes. The man's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You folks eaten today?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Pride warred with necessity, and necessity won. She shook her head, unable to meet his eyes. The man was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could feel him making some internal decision. When he spoke again, his voice was even gentler. "Name's Tom Bradley. I've got a ranch about 3 miles up that way." He gestured with a slight tilt of his head toward a dirt road that branched off from the highway. "You're welcome to come up to the house, get something to eat." Sarah felt tears threaten behind her eyes. After days of closed doors and turned backs, this simple offer felt like a miracle. But years of struggling alone had taught her caution. "I don't have money to pay you," she said. The words scraping her throat raw, Tom's eyes met hers again. As she saw something there that made her chest tight, not pity, but understanding. "Wasn't asking for any—" Miguel chose that moment to step out from behind her legs, looking up at the tall rancher with wide, hopeful eyes. "Do you have food at your house?" A ghost of a smile crossed Tom's weathered face. "I do. You like grilled cheese sandwiches?" Miguel nodded enthusiastically, and Sarah felt her careful walls beginning to crumble. This stranger, this quiet man with kind eyes, was offering them what no one else would, simple human decency in a world that had seemed to run out of it. "I don't want to impose," she said, though every fiber of her being was screaming at her to accept. Tom was already walking back toward his truck. "No imposition. I'll give you a ride up. We can worry about your car later." As they climbed into the warmth of his pickup truck, Sarah caught a glimpse of the man who had stopped for them. There was something solid about Tom Bradley, something that spoke of deep roots and quiet strength. His truck was clean but well used, with a thermos of coffee in the center console and work gloves on the dashboard. Classical music played softly from the radio, which surprised her. The dirt road wound through gentle hills dotted with cattle, and Sarah could see a cluster of buildings ahead, a modest ranch house with a wraparound porch, a large barn, and several outbuildings. It looked like the kind of place that had been in the same family for generations, where time moved slower and traditions mattered. As they pulled up to the house, Sarah noticed details that spoke of a careful, ordered life. Flower boxes beneath the windows that someone tended with love, a vegetable garden protected by neat rows of wire fencing, firewood stacked with mathematical precision. Against the side of the house, Tom parked near the front porch but made no move to get out immediately. Instead, he turned to look at Sarah and Miguel, his expression serious but not unkind. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "you're safe here. Whatever brought you to this road, whatever you're running from or toward, it doesn't matter to me. You're hungry, you need help, and I've got food and a warm house. That's all there is to it." Sarah felt something inside her chest unclench for the first time in weeks. She looked at this quiet rancher who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't even known how to pray, and whispered the words that would change everything. "Thank you." As they walked toward the house, Miguel slipping his small hand into hers, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had found exactly what they needed in the most unexpected place. The November wind still carried a bite, but wrapped in the promise of warmth and food and human kindness. It no longer felt like an enemy. Tom Bradley opened his front door and gestured for them to enter. And for the first time in days, Sarah Martinez and her son stepped across a threshold into safety. The interior of Tom Bradley's house revealed the same quiet attention to detail that marked his property. The living room was simple but comfortable, with worn leather furniture that had been well cared for and family photographs lining the mantelpiece. Sarah caught glimpses of a younger Tom with a woman whose smile lit up her entire face, and later photos that showed the passage of time but not the presence of children. "Bathrooms down that hall if you need to wash up," Tom said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I'll get started on those sandwiches." Sarah looked down at Miguel, whose face was streaked with dust from their days on the road, and realized how they must appear to this man who had welcomed them into his clean, orderly home. "We're pretty dirty," she said, embarrassment coloring her voice. "Soap and water fix most things," Tom replied matter-of-factly, already heading toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "Take your time." In the small but immaculate bathroom, Sarah helped Miguel wash his hands and face, using the soft towels that smelled like fabric softener and sunshine. She caught sight of herself in the mirror and winced. Her hair was tangled, her face gaunt with exhaustion and worry, her clothes wrinkled beyond redemption. But Miguel looked better already, his dark eyes beginning to brighten with the possibility of food when they emerged. The smell of melting butter and toasting bread drew them to a kitchen that could have belonged to anyone's grandmother. Copper pots hung from hooks above a well-seasoned gas stove, and the counters were clean but marked with the gentle wear of decades of use. Tom stood at the stove, carefully tending 3 sandwiches in a large cast-iron skillet. "Hope you don't mind grilled cheese and tomato soup," he said without turning around. "It's about the extent of my cooking skills." Sarah's stomach responded to the smell with an embarrassing growl, and she pressed her hand against it apologetically. Miguel had no such shame. He stood on tiptoe trying to peer over the edge of the counter, watching Tom work with the fascination of a starving child presented with magic. "Can I help?" Sarah asked, needing to do something, anything to earn the kindness being shown to them. "You can sit down and rest," Tom said, flipping the sandwiches with practiced ease. "When's the last time you did that?" The question hit closer to home than he probably realized. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had sat down without worrying about money or jobs, or where they would sleep that night. Even in their apartment, before the eviction, she had been constantly moving, working, planning. Trying to stay one step ahead of disaster, she pulled out a chair at the small kitchen table and lifted Miguel onto her lap, breathing in the scent of his hair and feeling the solid weight of him against her chest. For just a moment, she allowed herself to feel the safety of this warm kitchen, the promise of food, the unexpected gift of human kindness. Tom served them each a plate with a perfectly golden grilled cheese sandwich cut diagonally, alongside a steaming bowl of tomato soup that looked like it had come from a can but somehow tasted better than anything Sarah remembered eating. Miguel attacked his meal with the single-minded focus of the truly hungry, while Sarah forced herself to eat slowly, her shrunken stomach protesting the sudden influx of food. "This is really good," she managed between careful bites. Tom nodded acknowledgement while eating his own sandwich. And Sarah noticed that his portion was no larger than theirs, despite his size. The kitchen fell into comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of spoons against bowls and Miguel's small satisfied sighs. "Are you a real cowboy?" Miguel asked suddenly, his natural curiosity finally overcoming his hunger-driven focus. Tom's weathered face crinkled into what might have been amusement. "I raise cattle, so I suppose that makes me a rancher. Cowboys work for ranchers. Do you have horses?" "A few. Can I see them?" Sarah started to intervene. They had already imposed enough, but Tom answered before she could speak. "After you finish eating, we can take a walk to the barn." Miguel's face lit up with pure joy, and Sarah felt her heart clench. When had she last seen her son look that happy? Before the eviction notice, certainly. Before she lost her job? Before their small world had crumbled around them. As they finished their meal, Tom made no attempt to fill the silence with questions about their situation or polite conversation. Sarah found his quiet presence soothing after days of her own anxious chatter trying to keep Miguel's spirits up. This man seemed comfortable with silence in a way that spoke of someone who spent long hours alone with his thoughts. "Thank you," she said when they had finished. "You have no idea how much this means." Tom began clearing the dishes with efficient movements. "Everyone needs help sometimes. Not everyone gets it." He paused, a plate halfway to the sink, and looked at her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "No," he said quietly. "They don't." Something in his tone suggested he spoke from experience. And Sarah wondered what stories lay behind the photographs on his mantelpiece. What losses had taught him the value of simple kindness? True to his word, Tom led them to the barn after lunch, where Miguel's excitement reached fever pitch at the sight of 3 horses in the nearby pasture. Tom whistled low, and the animals lifted their heads with obvious recognition. Ambling over to the fence where he produced carrots from his jacket pocket. "This is Rosie," he said, indicating a gentle-eyed mare who nuzzled Miguel's outstretched palm with velvet softness. "She's got the best manners." "And that's Duke, and the bay mare is called Star." Miguel was speechless with wonder, and Sarah found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks as she watched her son's face transform with pure, uncomplicated joy. Tom lifted the boy so he could better reach the horses, and Sarah noticed how careful the rancher was, how patient with Miguel's endless questions. As the afternoon wore on, Tom showed them around the ranch with the quiet pride of a man who had built something lasting with his own hands. The barn was immaculate, the equipment well-maintained, the cattle healthy and calm. Everything spoke of years of careful stewardship, of someone who understood that the land was not just property, but a responsibility. "How long have you lived here?" Sarah asked as they walked back toward the house. 43 years. My dad bought this place in 1978, and I took it over when he passed. Tom's voice carried the weight of deep roots, of generations tied to this particular piece of earth. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and meant it. There was something about the ranch that spoke to a deep human need for permanence, for connection to the land, for the kind of stability she had never known. As evening approached, Sarah began to feel the familiar anxiety creeping back. Where would they sleep? Tom had fed them and shown them incredible kindness, but surely he expected them to move on. She began gathering herself to ask about the nearest town, about somewhere they might spend the night, when Tom spoke. "Guest rooms made up if you want to stay the night," he said without preamble, his tone making it clear the offer was genuine. "Your boy's tired and it's getting cold. Morning's time enough to figure out what's next." Sarah felt tears threaten again. "We can't keep imposing." "You're not imposing," Tom said with quiet firmness. "You're accepting help when it's offered. There's a difference." That evening, as Miguel fell asleep in a real bed for the first time in a week, Sarah stood at the guest room window looking out over the ranch bathed in moonlight. The cattle were dark shapes against the silver grass, and the horses stood quietly in their pasture, and everything spoke of peace in a way that made her chest ache with longing. She had spent so many years running from bad relationships, from jobs that didn't pay enough, from apartments she couldn't afford, from a future that always seemed just out of reach. But standing in this quiet room in this quiet house owned by this quiet man who asked for nothing in return for his kindness, Sarah began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, running wasn't the only option. Down the hall, she could hear Tom moving around his kitchen, washing the dinner dishes with the same careful attention he brought to everything. Through the thin walls, she heard him talking softly to someone, and it took her a moment to realize he was on the phone. "Yeah, their car's pretty much done for," she heard him say. "Engine seized up completely. No, they don't have anywhere else to go. A week or two, maybe longer." "I know, Martha, but what else was I supposed to do?" Sarah pressed her hand against her mouth, realizing he was making arrangements, possibly changing plans to accommodate two strangers who had literally appeared on his doorstep. The conversation continued in tones too low for her to make out words, but she heard the patient way he dealt with what sounded like gentle scolding from whoever Martha was. When the house finally fell quiet, Sarah lay awake in the comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the extraordinary day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new uncertainties. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she and Miguel were safe, fed, and warmed. And in the morning, she would begin to understand just how far Tom Bradley's quiet kindness was willing to extend. Sarah woke to the sound of coffee brewing and the low murmur of Tom's voice from the kitchen. Pale morning light filtered through the guest room curtains, and for a disorienting moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then reality settled back into place. The broken car, the highway, the quiet rancher who had taken them in without question. Miguel was still deeply asleep beside her, his small face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Sarah slipped quietly from the bed and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen, where she found Tom sitting at the table with his coffee and a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of comfortable authority that comes from years of managing things efficiently. She looked up as Sarah entered, her expression curious but not unfriendly. Sarah, this is Martha Henley, Tom said, rising from his chair with old-fashioned courtesy. She runs the town library and knows everything that happens within 50 miles of here. Martha extended a firm handshake and gestured for Sarah to sit. Tom called me last night. I brought some things I thought you and your boy might need. Sarah noticed several bags near the door that she hadn't seen the night before. You didn't have to do that. Course I did, Martha said briskly, pouring Sarah a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted one. Tom here's too polite to mention it. But you folks are going to need more than grilled cheese sandwiches if you're staying more than a day or two. The practical kindness in Martha's voice reminded Sarah of her own grandmother, and she felt tears threaten again. It seemed like crying was all she did lately, overwhelmed by the simple fact that strangers cared enough to help. I've been thinking about your situation, Tom said, settling back into his chair. Car like yours, with that kind of damage, it's going to cost more to fix than it's worth. But I've got that old pickup truck in the barn that's been sitting there for 2 years. Needs some work, but the engine's solid. Sarah stared at him. I can't afford to buy a truck? Wasn't selling it, Tom said quietly. Was thinking more like a trade? You do some work around here, help me get caught up on things, and you can use the truck to get to Colorado when you're ready. Martha nodded approvingly. Makes sense. Tom's been trying to organize that barn for years, and the house could use a woman's touch. His idea of decorating is hanging his father's old calendar on the wall. Hey, Tom protested mildly. And Sarah caught a glimpse of the friendship between these two that had probably spanned decades. What kind of work? Sarah asked carefully. She had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. Whatever needs doing, Tom said with a shrug. Barn needs organizing, house needs cleaning, garden needs attention. Nothing complicated, just time-consuming? Work. I've been putting off because there's always something else that needs doing first on a ranch. Sarah felt Miguel stirring in the guest room and heard his small feet hitting the floor. A moment later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair sticking up at impossible angles and eyes still heavy with sleep. Good morning, sweetheart, Sarah said, opening her arms. Miguel climbed onto her lap and buried his face against her neck, still warm and soft from sleep. You must be Miguel, Martha said with the kind of gentle authority that came from years of working with children. I brought you some books if you like to read. Miguel peered at her with shy interest. What kind of books? Oh, all kinds. Adventures and mysteries and stories about animals. Tom tells me you like the horses. As Miguel perked up at the mention of horses, Sarah found herself studying Tom's face. There was something careful about his expression when he looked at her son, a kind of wistful attention that spoke of old losses and might-have-beens. How long would this arrangement last? She asked, needing to understand the boundaries. As long as it takes, Tom said simply. Could be a week, could be a month. Depends on how much work you want to do and how quickly you want to get that truck running. Martha leaned forward. There's a job opening at the elementary school in town, too. They need someone in the office, just part-time, but it would give you some income while you're here. Principal's a friend of mine. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden possibility of stability, of a place to catch her breath and plan instead of simply reacting to one crisis after another. Why are you doing this? You don't even know us. Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he looked up, his pale blue eyes held a sadness that seemed to come from very deep places. My wife Ellen always said this house was too big for just 2 people, he said finally. We tried for years to fill it with children, but it wasn't meant to be. After she passed 3 years ago, it's been even quieter. Martha reached over and patted his weathered hand with obvious affection. Ellen would have loved this. She always said God put us here to help each other. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of shared loss and the way grief could carve out spaces that others might fill if you let them. I'm sorry about your wife. Tom nodded acknowledgement. She was a good woman. Would have liked you and Miguel, I think. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself saying yes to things she had never imagined possible. Yes to staying in the guest room for as long as needed. Yes, to helping organize the barn and clean the house. Yes, to letting Martha register Miguel for the local elementary school, just temporarily. Yes, to the part-time job at the school office that would give her enough money to start rebuilding their emergency fund. Most surprisingly, yes, to letting herself believe that maybe this unexpected detour could become something more than just a stopping point on their journey to somewhere else. The work began that very day. Tom showed Sarah through the barn, which was filled with decades of accumulated equipment, tools, and memories. Together, they began the slow process of sorting and organizing, creating order from chaos. Miguel helped when his attention span allowed, but more often he could be found in the pasture with the horses. Under Tom's patient supervision, Sarah discovered that Tom was a man of few words but many skills. He could fix almost anything, approach every problem with calm logic, and had an endless patience for Miguel's questions about ranch life. In return, Sarah brought organization to his household, cooking meals that were more elaborate than his usual simple fare, and slowly transforming the house from a place where a lonely man lived into something that felt like a home again. The truck in the barn turned out to need more work than Tom had initially thought, which meant their stay extended from days into weeks. Sarah found she didn't mind as much as she expected. The job at the school was exactly what she needed: regular hours, steady pay, and work that felt meaningful. Miguel thrived in the small-town school, making friends and discovering a love of reading that Martha had nurtured with her carefully chosen books. Most surprisingly, Sarah found herself looking forward to the evenings when the three of them would sit on Tom's front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple while Miguel played with a barn cat who had adopted him. These quiet moments felt like something she had been searching for without knowing it: peace, stability, the simple rhythm of days built around work and rest rather than crisis and reaction. One evening, as she and Tom worked side by side in comfortable silence, sorting through boxes of his wife's belongings that he hadn't been able to face alone, Sarah realized that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being temporary. The truck was nearly ready. Her sister in Colorado still expected them, but the thought of leaving filled her with something that felt remarkably like homesickness for a place she was still living in. "Tom," she said quietly, holding up a photograph of him and Ellen standing in front of the same house where they now sat, both of them young and radiant with hope. "What if we stayed? Not just until the truck is ready, but really stayed?" Tom set down the box he was holding and looked at her with those pale blue eyes that had come to mean safety and kindness and the possibility of a different kind of future. "I was hoping you'd ask," he said simply. 6 months later, Sarah would look out the kitchen window of what had become their home and watch Miguel teaching Tom's horses to come when he whistled, the way Tom had taught him. She would think about the broken car on the highway that had seemed like the end of everything but had actually been the beginning of the life they were meant to have. The house was full of laughter again. The barn was organized and functional, and the garden that Ellen had planted years before bloomed under Sarah's careful attention. In the evenings, they still sat on the front porch, but now it was their porch, their sunset, their shared peace. Tom had been right that first day. Everyone needs help sometimes. But what he hadn't mentioned, what Sarah learned in the months that followed, was that sometimes helping others helps heal the helper too. The quiet rancher had opened his door to strangers in need and found that they filled the spaces in his life he hadn't even realized were empty. The town that had initially been just a stopping place became home. The job at the school became a career. The guest room became Miguel's room, filled with books and drawings and the comfortable clutter of a child who knew he belonged somewhere. And sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the cattle were settled and Miguel